Behind the facade of a happy marriage, smiles in family photos, and glossy success, there are secret correspondences, stolen kisses, and schemes that can burn you. Are you ready to see how love cracks under the blow of harsh truth and revenge becomes the only way forward? Then pour your strongest tea, we are beginning. Night had settled over the house like a heavy blanket, drowning out the sounds of the outside world, and leaving only the faint creaking of old pine floorboards to break the silence. In the heart of Austin, Texas, where the pace of the city slowed to a lazy hum on quiet residential streets, Daniel Harper sat alone in the living room of his craftsman-style home. The room was warm and cozy, with low ceilings and a single lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. Photos of happier times lined the mantel, vacations in Galveston, his children taking their first steps, Emily's beaming smile at their wedding. But today, the images seemed like relics from a life he no longer recognized. The air was heavy with something unsaid, something that had been smoldering beneath the surface longer than he cared to admit. Daniel slumped in a worn leather chair, his fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. The children, Lily and Max, were asleep in the room down the hall, their soft snores distant and hardly comforting in the oppressive silence. Emily, his wife of 12 years, had slipped out of the living room 20 minutes ago, muttering something about needing to brew her favorite lavender and mint tea to calm her nerves. "I can't sleep," she said, her voice light but distracted, her eyes avoiding him as she walked barefoot toward the kitchen. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd been insomnia for weeks, she'd said, and he'd grown accustomed to her nightly rituals. But now, alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. Emily was always meticulous about it, closing it, locking it, tucking it into her bag before bed. But today she'd left it unattended, a rare lapse in her usually cautious habits. Daniel's gaze slid involuntarily to the laptop, spurred by a spark of curiosity or perhaps something deeper, more instinctive. He leaned forward, setting his mug down with a soft clink, and pulled the laptop toward him. The screen flickered to life, revealing a folder simply titled Photos_2024. Nothing too alarming, he thought. Probably just pictures from Lily's soccer games or Max's birthday party last month. But as his finger hovered over the trackpad, a shiver of alarm ran down his spine. He clicked. The folder opened, revealing a neatly organized grid of files, photos, and videos, each tiny icon a window into a world he hadn't expected to see. At first, he thought he was mistaken, that his tired eyes were deceiving him in the dim light. He blinked, leaning closer, his breath catching in his throat. The pictures weren't of football games or birthday cakes. They were of Emily in poses that made his stomach clench. In one photo, she stood in a dimly lit room, her hair loose and tangled, wearing only a sheer nightgown that clung to her figure. Her smile was languid, aimed at someone off camera. In another, her arms were wrapped around a man's shoulders, her lips pressed to his neck. The man's face was partially hidden, but Daniel recognized those shoulders, that tousled dark hair, that easy confidence in his posture. It was Rick. Rick Sullivan, his best friend since their college days at the University of Texas at Austin, the guy who was best man at their wedding, who spent countless Sundays grilling meat in their backyard. Daniel's heart began to pound, each blow like a hammer against his crumbling world. His fingers shook as he scrolled through the files, unable to stop, like a driver slowing down to watch a car crash. There were dozens of them, photos, videos, screenshots of conversations. He opened one of the videos, leaving the sound off. The grainy image showed Emily laughing, her head thrown back, dancing in a dimly lit bar, Rick's hands on her waist. The date on the video was 3 weeks old, the night she told Daniel she'd be working late at work at the gallery. He believed her. Why not? She'd always been his rock, the anchor that kept him afloat through the chaos of raising 2 kids and running a small architecture firm. He clicked on a screenshot of the conversation, and the words burned into his brain like acid. "Can't wait to see you tonight, honey," Emily had written. "You make me feel alive." Rick's reply was a string of heart emojis and a single word: soon. Another message, dated 2 days earlier. Our secret is safe. He doesn't suspect a thing. Daniel's vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer force of rage and disbelief. He wanted to scream, to throw his laptop across the room, to storm into the kitchen and demand answers. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he froze, his mind racing to piece together the pieces of this betrayal. How long has this been going on? Months? Years? The thought made him sick. He remembered all the times Rick had been at their house, drinking beer on the porch, joking with the kids, casually throwing an arm around Emily's shoulders in a gesture Daniel had always thought was friendly. Had it all been a lie? Was every laugh, every look, a mockery of their life together? He forced himself to keep scrolling, each new file a fresh wound. One photo showed Emily and Rick in a hotel, a modern affair with floor-to-ceiling windows. Another showed them on a hiking trail that Daniel recognized as a state park outside Austin, where Emily said she'd gone with her book club. The lies piled up, each one a brick in the wall that now separated him from the woman he thought he knew. The sound of footsteps pulled him out of his trance. Emily was returning. He folded the folder hastily, his heart pounding as he tried to keep his expression neutral. She walked into the room, holding a steaming mug, her chestnut hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked so ordinary, so annoyingly familiar, that for a moment Daniel doubted what he was seeing. Maybe this was a prank, a misunderstanding. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't involve his wife and best friend ruining his world. "Are you okay, honey?" Emily asked, her voice soft but tinged with something nervousness, guilt. She set her mug down on the coffee table and glanced at her laptop, her brows furrowing slightly. "You've been sitting too long." "Yeah," Daniel managed, his throat tight. He forced a smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "I just can't sleep either." He reached for his iced tea, taking a sip so he wouldn't have to look her in the eye. The bitterness of the chamomile mirrored the taste in his mouth, a mixture of shock and betrayal lingering on his tongue. Emily nodded, seemingly satisfied, and sank down onto the sofa opposite him. She tucked her legs under her, the picture of domesticity. "Work getting to you?" she asked, tilting her head. "You've been so quiet all evening." He wanted to laugh, a bitter, empty laugh. Quiet? He was a volcano on the verge of erupting, every nerve screaming to spill it all, to demand the truth. But he held back. For now. If he spoke now, he would lose control, and he couldn't let that happen. Not with the children sleeping down the hall, not when he didn't have all the facts. He needed to be smarter, gather more evidence, understand the depth of this deception before he made his move. "Just tired," he said, his voice even. He stood up, stretching as if nothing were wrong, and moved to the chair in front of the television. He clicked the remote, and the low hum of a late-night talk show filled the room with artificial cheerfulness. Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable, then picked up her mug and took a sip of tea. The silence between them was chasm, wide and unbridgeable. The minutes dragged on, and Daniel's mind raced. He replayed every moment of their marriage in his head, searching for clues he'd missed. The late nights at the gallery, her sudden interest in weekend hikes, the way she'd started putting a password on her phone last summer. He chalked it up to her busy schedule, the demands of her job as an art gallery curator. He trusted her. He loved her, and she was making a fool of him. His gaze slid back to his laptop, now closed on the coffee table. He needed to know more. He needed proof, irrefutable proof, something to hold on to when the inevitable conversation came. But most of all, he needed a plan. The rage boiling in his chest wasn't just pain, it was a spark, a fuse waiting to ignite. He wouldn't let this destroy him. He wouldn't let Emily and Rick get away with it. "I'm going to bed," Emily said, breaking the silence. She stood up, stretched, and gave him a small smile. "Don't stay up too long, okay?" "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. He watched her disappear down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps fading into silence. Once she was gone, he turned back to his laptop, his hands shaking as he opened it again. He went to the folder, clenching his jaw as he began copying files onto the flash drive he kept in his desk drawer. Every photo, every video, every damn message, he had saved it all, building a case against the woman he swore he'd love forever. The clock on the wall ticked toward 6 o'clock, the world outside fading into the golden haze of a Texas sunset. Daniel's life had shattered in the space of an hour, but he wasn't about to let it stop there. He wasn't the type to break, to let betrayal define him. Sitting in the dim light of the living room, the thumb drive heavy in his pocket, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't make a scene tonight. He wouldn't scream or cry or beg for the truth. Instead, he would wait, gather his strength, and weaponize her lies. The truth was his now, and he was going to wield it with surgical precision. As the night wore on, Daniel Harper began to formulate a plan. The silence in the house was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emily's footsteps, soft and measured, had long since faded, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts, swirling in his head like dry leaves in an autumn breeze. He sat in the living room, staring at the screen of his laptop, where the spreadsheet of an architectural design for a new office building on the outskirts of Austin was still open. The lines and numbers blurred before his eyes, losing their meaning. His mind refused to focus on the work at hand. Instead of drawings and calculations, images of Emily and Rick appeared before him, their glances, their laughter, their secrets that, as it turned out, had been hidden in plain sight. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers unconsciously clutching his cold mug of tea, as if it could keep him from falling over the edge. He closed his eyes, and memories began to play in his head like old tapes. Summer 2010, a hot August in Austin, when the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That was when he first introduced Emily to Rick. She and Rick were inseparable, two ambitious young architects who had just started their own small firm. Rick was the life of the party, tall, with unkempt dark hair, a twinkle in his eye, and a witty joke at the ready. He knew how to break any awkward silence, to make everyone laugh, even when things weren't going well. Daniel trusted him like a brother. They shared dreams, beer, long nights drawing, teasing each other until their company began to bear fruit. Emily was everything to Daniel then. Her smile, her easy laugh, her habit of thoughtfully twirling a lock of hair around her finger while she talked about a new show at the gallery. She was his inspiration, his anchor. And Rick seemed to understand it. He was the best man at their wedding, gave a toast that even Emily's skeptical aunt surreptitiously wiped away tears. "You two are like a perfect blueprint," he said then, raising his glass. "Every line in its place, and together you create something beautiful." Daniel laughed then, clapped Rick on the shoulder, unaware that these words would one day turn into bitter irony. Now, sitting in the dim living room, Daniel felt a hot band tightening around his chest. He tried to remember when everything had started to change. Were there signs? Moments he had missed. Rick comes to dinner with a bottle of whiskey, his light touch on Emily's shoulder, her laugh a little louder than usual. Daniel had always considered it a friendly warmth, natural for people who had known each other for more than a decade. But now each of those moments felt like a betrayal, carefully disguised as the mundane. His gaze fell on the coffee table, where Emily's laptop lay, still open, the screen dim, but ready to betray her secrets. But it wasn't the only source of truth. Yesterday, after their last meeting at the office, Rick, as usual, had left his laptop on the conference room table, the screen casually turned. He and Daniel had been up late discussing a project for a new client, and Rick, as always, had been absent-minded. He'd left the laptop open and run out to answer a call. Daniel hadn't paid it any mind at the time, but as he was going back to get his papers, he'd caught a glimpse of the open instant messenger tab. A few words, caught by chance, struck him like lightning. "Midnight, room 304. Can't wait, love. Darling." The words still echoed in his head like a gunshot. He froze then, standing over the table, not believing his eyes. His fingers reached for the trackpad, scrolling through the correspondence. The messages between Rick and Emily flowed like a river, dozens, hundreds of lines, full of intimate details, plans for meetings, words that should not have existed between his wife and his best friend. "You make my heart beat faster," Emily wrote. "Soon, baby, just you and me. Rick replied, and then a screenshot from the hotel where they had apparently spent the night 3 weeks ago. Daniel felt the floor slip out from under his feet. His best friend, the man he considered almost a brother, kissing his wife, hugging her, promising her something that belonged only to him, to Daniel. Fuck, he said now, in the quiet of the living room, just as he had in the office. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, leaving red crescents. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to Rick, not to Emily. But reality was merciless, and it was staring him in the face through their laptop screens, through their fake smiles, through their carefully hidden secrets. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. He walked over to the desk where his phone was and plugged in the flash drive. He'd copied Rick's messages onto the day before in the office. He acted quickly before his mind could become clouded by emotion. He opened the files, skimming through the messages again, each word like a knife thrust. There were details he hadn't noticed at first. The address of a hotel in downtown Austin, the mention of a quiet place by the lake, where they'd met last month, even hints that Emily was planning a trip with Rick, disguising it as a business trip. None of this had been an impulsive mistake. It had been a pattern, a carefully constructed web of lies, with Daniel a pawn. He copied the new files onto the flash drive, adding them to the ones he had already taken from Emily's laptop. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage, cold and sharp as a blade. He wasn't going to make a scene, wasn't going to storm into the kitchen and yell at Emily or call Rick to accuse him. That would be too easy, too impulsive. No, he would act coldly. He would become the shadow who knew everything but didn't give himself away. He would begin his own game secret, calculating, where every move would be thought out to the smallest detail. Daniel returned to his chair, his gaze falling on the window where dawn was breaking. The sky above Austin was slowly brightening, turning soft shades of pink and gold, but inside he was restless. He remembered Rick telling him once, during one of their late-night beer sessions, "Dan, you and I are like brothers. No one can come between us." It had seemed true then. Now it was another lie to add to the list. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Time to act," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't let them get away with it. Emily and Rick had destroyed his world, but he wasn't going to fall to his knees. He would gather evidence, build a plan, and when the time came, he would show them what it meant to play with fire. Dawn was breaking outside the window, but for Daniel, it wasn't a new day, it was the beginning of a war. He clutched the flash drive in his hand, its cold metal the only thing that felt real. The game was on, and he was going to win. Evening fell softly over Austin like a heavy velvet curtain, draping the city in deep shades of blue and purple. Lady Bird Lake, at the heart of the city, reflected the flickering of streetlights and neon signs, creating the illusion of a starry sky that had fallen to the ground. A light breeze carried the scent of dampness and magnolia blossoms, mingling with the distant hum of evening traffic. Daniel walked along the narrow path along the shore, his boots crunching on the gravel, each step echoing in his chest as if he carried the weight of a truth just revealed. He was heading for the Moontide Bar, a small place tucked behind old oak trees, far from the noisy cafes and trendy restaurants. The place seemed to exist outside of time. Worn wooden walls, soft brass light, the smell of whiskey and old wood. The perfect refuge for a conversation that could either save him or end everything he knew. Daniel was in a turmoil inside rage, pain, determination, but he forced himself to breathe evenly, repeating like a mantra, "Control. You have to stay in control." The bar greeted him with a muted warmth and the sound of a saxophone, its melody flowing like a river, softening the sharp edges of this difficult evening. There were few people inside, a couple of couples at the bar, a few singles buried in their drinks, and she, Sophie, sitting in the corner by the window. Her slender silhouette stood out against the dark glass that reflected the lights of the lake. Sophie, Rick's wife, was a woman whose beauty seemed almost fragile, as if carved from fine porcelain. Her blonde hair was pulled back carelessly into a bun, strands escaping around her face. Her brown eyes, even from a distance, held a hint of weariness and hidden sadness, as if she had long been carrying a secret too heavy to share. She held a glass of white wine, thoughtfully twirling it in her fingers until she noticed Daniel. Her lips twitched in a weak smile, but there was no joy in it, only politeness, behind which one could guess anxiety. "Hi, Dan," she said as he approached the table. Her voice was soft, but there was a tension in it, like someone waiting to be hit. "I didn't expect you to want to meet so suddenly. Is everything okay?" Daniel sank into the chair opposite him, his fingers instinctively gripping the wooden edge of the table, seeking support. He ordered a whiskey from a passing waitress, buying himself a few seconds to collect his thoughts. Sophie was watching him carefully, her gaze almost searching, and he realized that she already sensed that something was wrong. Her eyes, usually warm, now seemed wary, as if she were preparing for the worst. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the air burn in his lungs, and decided to begin. "Sophie," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, so as not to attract the attention of the other customers. "You don't know anything about Rick and Emily?" Her reaction was instant, if subtle. Her eyes widened, pupils darkening as if absorbing the dim light from the lamp above their table. She froze, her fingers holding the glass so tight her knuckles turned white, and for a moment Daniel thought she was going to drop it. But Sophie quickly composed herself. Her face was unreadable, but the huskiness in her voice gave her away. "What's wrong, Dan?" she asked, trying to sound even, but her words trembled like a thin string ready to snap. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked her straight in the eye, feeling the last barrier crumble inside him. He pulled a flash drive out of his pocket, small and unassuming, but heavy with the truth it carried. He placed it on the table between them, as if it were not a piece of plastic, but a weapon loaded with their shared grief. It landed with a soft thud, and the sound seemed to echo in the silence of their pause. "I found proof," he said, his voice firmer, but still filled with pain he couldn't hide. "Photos, videos, text messages. Emily and Rick, they've been together. For a long time. This isn't an accident, Sophie. It's a pattern. They've been lying to both of us." Sophie stared at the flash drive, her breathing coming in short gasps, her chest heaving as if she were fighting back rising panic. She slowly set her glass down, her hands shaking, but she kept her eyes on the small black rectangle. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity, filled with the clinking of glasses, the whispers of other customers, and the distant melody of a saxophone that now sounded almost mocking. "I knew," she finally whispered, her voice so quiet Daniel had to lean in close to hear. "I wasn't sure, but I suspected. For months, Rick was different. The late-night calls he'd take in another room, the impromptu meetings in the evenings, the smell of someone else's perfume on his shirts. I'd find receipts from hotels he'd never been to, text messages he'd immediately deleted. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that I was just paranoid. But," she trailed off, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shining with suppressed tears. "I even started filing for divorce. For our daughter, for Ella. I wanted to get her away from all this, to start a new life. But I wasn't sure until tonight." Daniel felt his heart tighten, as if it were being squeezed with an iron fist. He had known Sophie for almost as long as he had known Rick. She was kind, strong, always finding time to help, whether it was organizing a school party for their kids or just getting him a cup of coffee when he needed to vent. She was the one who held their group together while the men were lost in their ambitions and projects. And now she sat before him, as broken as he was, but still holding on, as if there was a steel rod inside her that refused to bend under the weight of betrayal. "So we're both trapped," he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. He clenched his fist under the table, his nails digging into his palm, leaving red marks. "Both betrayed by those they trusted most. Emily, she was my everything. And Rick, I considered him a brother. How could they?" Sophie looked up at him, and he saw something else in her eyes, not just pain, but a spark of determination that mirrored his own. She smiled slightly, but it was a bitter, almost painful smile, like someone who had hidden her wounds for too long. They could because they thought we wouldn't know, she said, her voice growing a little firmer, as if she were finding strength with each word. They thought they could live in their own little world while we played happy families. But they were wrong, Dan. We won't break. Not now. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something changed. It wasn't romance or passion, no, it was a connection deeper, almost primal. Two men wounded by the same blade had found an ally in each other. Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, as if he were finally breathing after being underwater for so long. Sophie reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist, a gesture of support, but there was more to it than sympathy. It was a promise, silent but unbreakable. "What now?" she asked, her voice calmer, but there was a sense of action in it. She removed her hand, but her gaze remained firm, as if she had already made a decision that would change everything. Daniel looked at the flash drive, then back at Sophie. His mind had already begun to formulate a plan as they sat in this bar, surrounded by other people's conversations and music. He remembered Emily smiling at him in the morning as she handed him her coffee, Rick clapping him on the shoulder last week and saying, "You and I, Dan, always together." The memories felt like poison now, but they also fueled his resolve. He didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. He would no longer be a victim. And from the look in Sophie's eyes, she was no longer one. "We'll gather everything we can," he said, his voice cold and calculating, like a man who can already see the chessboard in front of him. "Evidence, details, everything they tried to hide. I've already copied their correspondence, photos, and videos. But that's not enough. We need more, something they can't deny. And then we'll decide how to respond. Together." Sophie nodded, her eyes glittering in the lamplight, but now there was fire in them as well as pain. She curled her fingers around the glass, as if drawing strength from it. "I found some things too," she said quietly. "Receipts, credit card statements from Rick that he didn't explain. I saved them in case, if I had to. And I saw him hide the other phone. I didn't dare check, but now I will." Daniel couldn't help but look at her with respect. Sophie, whom he had always thought of as soft and reserved, was much stronger than he had thought. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, ready to fight for her daughter, for her life. And now they were on the same side. "Then let's start with this," he said. "You check his phone, I'll continue digging through Emily's laptop. We'll share everything we find. No secrets between us, Sophie, just the truth." "The truth," she repeated, her voice firm as an oath. She raised her glass, and Daniel, after a moment's hesitation, clinked his whiskey with hers. The drink burned his throat, but it was a good pain, a reminder that he was still alive, still able to fight. They finished their drinks in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but no longer alone. The bar around them was alive with its own life. The saxophonist was starting a new tune, the waitress was laughing with someone at the bar, the silhouettes of passers-by were floating past the window. But for Daniel and Sophie, this evening had become a turning point, a point of no return. "It's time to go," Sophie said, standing up. She glanced out the window at the lake, her expression softening for a moment, as if she were searching the water for answers. "Ella's home with a nanny, but I don't want to leave her for long." Daniel nodded, paid for their drinks, and followed her out the door. They stepped outside, the cool night air hitting their faces, sobering them. The moon hung over the lake, its silver light reflecting off the water, creating a path that seemed to lead to another world. They walked side by side, their footsteps in unison, their hands occasionally brushing, but neither of them pulled away. There was something comforting about the light touch, as if they were reminding each other that they were not alone in this battle. "We'll get through this, Dan," Sophie said, stopping by her car. Her voice was quiet, but there was confidence in it. "They thought they could break us, but they were wrong." "Yes," he answered, looking into her eyes. "They were wrong." She nodded, opened the car door, and climbed behind the wheel. Daniel watched her car disappear into the night, headlights flashing one last time before disappearing around the corner. He was left alone in the empty parking lot, clutching the flash drive in his pocket. It was a long road ahead, full of uncertainty, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had an ally. Sophie wasn't just Rick's wife. She was his ally, his mirror, his chance at justice. He turned and walked toward his truck, parked nearby. The night was quiet, but a fire was already burning inside him. The past was no longer his guide. Now he was guided by the truth and the revenge he was about to share with Sophie. The night in Austin was warm, with a hint of dampness rising from Lady Bird Lake. The rented condo on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood where old houses rubbed shoulders with modern lofts, was shrouded in silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional cicada. Inside, the small living room was dim, a single lamp on a low table casting soft shadows on the neutral gray walls. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint smell of new furniture, creating an oddly calming atmosphere despite the turmoil raging in the hearts of the two people sitting across from each other. Daniel and Sophie sat at a small glass table, littered with printouts, flash drives, and a laptop whose screen glowed with a cold blue light. On the table lay several miniature devices, cameras, and microphones that Sophie had smuggled out of the house, hiding them in her bag under the guise of cosmetics and children's toys. These were the tools of their new game, their weapons in the war they had declared on Emily and Rick. In the center of the table stood a steaming cup of coffee and a folder of printouts that Daniel had collected over the past few days. Each sheet was soaked in their shared pain, each document a step toward the truth that they were going to use like a blade. "They don't suspect anything," Daniel began, his voice low but firm, as if he'd been rehearsing these words all night. He pushed a stack of papers toward Sophie, his fingers shaking slightly with suppressed tension. "Look, here's Rick's correspondence with Emily, and I found traces of wire transfers. They were moving money from our company accounts to some other account. This is their trail, Sophie. Proof that they're not just lovers, but accomplices." Sophie leaned over the papers, her blonde hair falling into her face, and she pushed it impatiently behind her ear. Her eyes, usually soft, now had a cold, almost predatory gleam as she studied the lines. She picked up one of the sheets, a bank statement with the transfer amounts highlighted in red marker. Her lips tightened as she spotted the familiar figures. "The money was funneled through shell accounts," she said, her voice calm but steely, "straight into Rick's personal account, all under the guise of some project of Emily's. Dirty, but clever. They're using our firm to finance their adventures." She looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "That's what they needed us for, Dan. We were their front." Daniel nodded, his jaw tense, his knuckles white on the edge of the table. He already knew about the financial shenanigans he'd stumbled across them while digging through old firm records, trying to distract himself from the pain of betrayal. But hearing it from Sophie, seeing her face twist with the same rage that burned within him, was both wrenching and liberating. They were in this together, two people whose lives had been torn apart by the same hands. "Rick didn't just sleep with my wife," he said, his voice lower, almost menacing. "He built his own business on our firm, used us to finance their second life. It's not just cheating, Sophie. It's betrayal on every level." Sophie put the papers down, her hands shaking slightly, but she quickly composed herself, straightening her back. She pulled a small box of microphones from her bag and laid them out neatly on the table. The devices were tiny, almost unnoticeable, perfect for their plan. She picked one up, twirling it in her fingers, and looked at Daniel. "We'll mirror their game," she said, her voice firm but with a hint of excitement in it, like someone who's just found a target. "They think they can lie to us, manipulate us, live off us. But we'll be smarter. We'll plant these bugs in their cars, in Rick's office, in Emily's gallery. We'll collect everything, every word, every move they make. And when we have enough, we'll turn their world upside down the way they turned ours upside down." Daniel looked at her, and something in his chest tightened, not from pain, but from a strange, almost painful admiration. Sophie, whom he had always thought of as soft, even fragile, now looked like a warrior ready for battle. Her determination was infectious, and he felt his own fury turning into a cold, calculating plan. "I'll start with the office," he said, picking up one of the microphones and examining it. "Rick never locks his office. I can set this up tomorrow when he goes to lunch. And can you get into Emily's gallery?" Sophie nodded, her lips curling into a small, almost predatory smile. "She thinks I'm just a friend's wife who occasionally drops by exhibitions. I can pretend to be interested in the new collection. No one will suspect." They fell silent, their eyes meeting in the dim light, the air between them crackling with tension. This wasn't just a plan for revenge, it was their way of taking back control, of taking back their lives from those who had tried to destroy them. The silence in the condo was almost tangible, broken only by the low hum of the recording devices they were testing before installing them. Daniel looked at Sophie, her slender fingers fumbling with the wires, her expression focused, and suddenly realized that this evening had been more than just the beginning of their plan. It had been the moment when their pain, their rage, their determination had woven together to create something new. "We'll do it, Sophie," he said quietly, his voice full of confidence. "We'll make them pay." She looked up at him, and there was a spark in her eyes, not just determination, but something deeper, almost intimate. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist, and the contact was like electricity. Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't romance in the usual sense, not love, not passion, but something more complex, born of their shared pain and desire to restore justice. But in that moment, in that half-light, the line between allies and something more began to blur. "We'll do this together," she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't remove her hand, and he didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, letting the silence speak for them. And then, almost unconsciously, they leaned in. Their kiss was not about love, but about the need to feel that they were not alone, that their struggle had meaning. It was brief, but full of fire, as if they had poured all their pain, all their determination into him. When they pulled away, their breathing was heavy, their eyes full of silent agreement. This night had changed the rules of the game. They were no longer just victims. They were players, and their moves were just beginning. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers still wrapped around her hand. "We'll start tomorrow," he said, his voice firm as an oath. "We'll plant bugs, we'll gather evidence, and when the time comes, they'll know what true betrayal is." Sophie nodded, her eyes glittering in the dim light. "They thought they could play with us," she said, her voice cold as a blade. "But now we play by our own rules." They finished their coffee, gathered up their devices and papers, and walked out of the condo into the night. The moon hung high, its light reflecting off the windows like a mirror, reminding them of what they had planned, to mirror the betrayal, but to do it subtly, with surgical precision. This night had been their first step in a game that could not be stopped. The night in Austin was heavy, drenched in a cold, foggy haze that seemed to swallow the streetlights and blur the outlines of buildings into a gray haze. Daniel Carter walked through the deserted streets on the outskirts of town, his boots thumping on the wet asphalt, his breath puffing out in white clouds in the cool air. He was headed toward the abandoned Old Oak Cafe, a place that had once been popular with the locals, but now stood empty, its paint peeling off its sign and its cracked glass hidden behind half-closed shutters. A single lamp shone through the cracks, a dim glow that was the only beacon in the night, guiding Daniel to Sophie. It was cold inside the cafe, despite the heater humming in the corner, trying in vain to warm the damp room. Sophie Stanton sat at an old wooden desk covered in papers, her fingers nervously fingering a stack of printouts, as if searching for answers to questions she dared not ask out loud. A cup of coffee trembled in her hands, steam rising in thin streams, dissolving into the gloom. Her face, lit by the dim light of the lamp, was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights and heavy thoughts. But her gaze burned with determination, mixed with pain, like a person who knows there is no turning back. Daniel walked in, closing the door quietly behind him so as not to attract attention. He glanced at the empty tables and chairs, covered in a thin layer of dust, and felt his heart clench. This place, once so full of life, now seemed like the perfect metaphor for their broken worlds. He walked over to Sophie, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and sank into the chair opposite her. She looked up at him, her gaze at once tired and sharp as a blade. "Is that all?" she asked quietly, her voice shaking but with steel in it. She pushed the flash drive toward him, her fingers lightly brushing the cold plastic, as if she were afraid to let go of this small piece of truth. Daniel looked at the flash drive, then at Sophie. His eyes reflected the same weariness as hers, but underneath it was a determination that was cold and unyielding. He pulled several folded bank statements from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed them on the table, next to her papers. Each line on those sheets was another nail in the coffin of their old life. "And one more thing," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse with effort. "This isn't just cheating, Sophie. This is a pattern. They weren't just sleeping with each other. They were using us, our firm, our lives, to build something for themselves. Look at these wire transfers. Money was going from our accounts to shell companies and from there to Rick's personal account, all under the guise of Emily's projects." Sophie picked up one of the statements, her fingers shaking as she forced herself to read the numbers. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her eyes narrowed as she noticed the familiar amounts, the same ones she'd seen on the receipts she'd found in Rick's pockets. She slowly put the paper back, her movements almost mechanical, as if she were afraid any sudden movement would shatter her fragile composure. "They used us," she whispered, her voice thick with bitterness. "All this time, we were just tools to them. I thought it was just an affair, that Rick was just weak. But this is worse. This is a betrayal, not just of us, but of everything we've built." She clutched the papers to her chest, as if they could protect her from the heartbreaking emotion. Her gaze fell on the thin silver chain around her wrist, a gift from Rick for their 10th anniversary. Once, that small piece of metal had been a symbol of their love, their promises to each other. Now it seemed like a mockery, a venomous reminder of how blind she had been. Sophie clenched her fist around the chain, her nails digging into her skin, but she felt no pain, only rage, slowly replacing the despair. "I know what I have to do next," she said, her voice firmer, as if she were speaking to herself rather than Daniel. "I talked to a lawyer. There's enough evidence to start a case. Divorce, division of property, maybe even a lawsuit against Rick for defrauding the firm. But," she paused, her eyes meeting Daniel's, "this isn't just about the money or the marriage, is it? This is about making them feel like they've lost." Daniel nodded, his jaw tensing. He felt the same thing, a hunger not just for justice, but for retribution. Emily and Rick had ruined their lives, and now it was their turn to pay. He took the flash drive Sophie had given him and plugged it into his laptop. The screen came to life, showing folders of messages, photos, screenshots. Each message, each snapshot was a blow, but now those blows only spurred his resolve. "We're not just going to collect evidence," he said, his voice cold as steel. "We're going to make them give themselves away. I've bugged Rick's office and Emily's car. I got the first recordings tonight. They're still meeting Sophie, right under our noses, but they don't know we're watching." Sophie leaned closer, her eyes glittering in the dim light as she looked at the screen. Rick's voice was on one of the audio files Daniel had played, low and confident, with that intonation that Daniel had once thought was friendly, but now sounded like mockery. "It's all under control, kid," Rick was saying. "Dan won't suspect a thing, and Sophie, she's too busy with her daughter to pry into my affairs." Emily's voice answered, soft and ingratiating. "You're right. We're safe. Just, let's be careful. I don't want to lose everything." Sophie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "They think we're blind," she hissed, "that we're just pawns in their game, but they're wrong." Daniel turned off the recording, his face unreadable, but inside he was a storm. He remembered Emily smiling at him in the morning, serving him toast and coffee, asking about his plans for the day as if nothing had changed. He remembered Rick clapping him on the shoulder last week, laughing at some joke, as if they were still brothers. Those memories felt like poison now, but they also gave him the strength to move on. "We'll play their game," he said, his voice calm but menacing. but by our rules. We'll collect everything, every word, every move they make. And when we have enough, we won't just divorce them. We'll destroy their world the way they destroyed ours." Sophie nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. She pulled another folder from her bag, her own findings. "I found Rick's second phone," she said. "He kept it hidden in a desk drawer under a pile of old papers. There were even more messages. And," she paused, her voice breaking, "there were pictures. Not just Emily. Other women. He's not just cheating on me. He's playing with all of us." Daniel felt his stomach clench. He knew Rick was capable of much, but this revelation added another layer to their shared pain. He reached out and covered her hand with his touch firm but comforting. "We'll deal with this," he said. "Together. We won't let him get away with it." Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. "Thank you, Dan," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something changed. The silence of the cafe, the cold light of the lamp, the smell of coffee, all of it faded into the background, leaving only the two of them. They were more than just allies in this war. They were two people whose lives had been destroyed by the same hands, and that shared pain connected them more than they could have expected. Sophie squeezed his hand, her fingers cold, but there was power in that touch. "We will do it," she said, her voice firm as an oath. "We will make them pay." They continued to work, sorting through papers, reviewing notes, and planning their next move. A few blocks away, in his office, Rick Stanton was on the phone with one of his business partners, his voice sharp and impatient. He was discussing new accounts, offshores, construction contracts, terms that seemed lifeless, but to Daniel and Sophie, part of their plan. Every word Rick spoke, every step he took, brought him closer to a fall he hadn't expected. Sophie lay awake all night, her eyes aching from lack of sleep, but she continued to look through files, take notes, and plot their revenge. Dark circles covered her face as the morning wore on, but her resolve only grew stronger. She knew this game was dangerous, the stakes were high, but there was no turning back. It was getting light outside, the sky over Austin was slowly turning pink and gold, but for Sophie and Daniel, this was not a new day, but a new stage in their war. They left the cafe at dawn, their steps firm and their eyes full of determination. A double game lay ahead of them, where every move was filled with pain, but also with hope for justice. They knew their journey would be long, but they were ready. Rick and Emily thought they had the game under control, but they didn't know that their opponents had already made the first move. Dawn over Austin was slow and hesitant, as if the sun itself was hesitant to awaken this city steeped in secrets and pain. The fog that still clung to the pines on the hills was dissolving in the first rays, revealing a panorama of sleeping streets and the glassy surface of Lady Bird Lake, where the sky was reflected in pink and gold strokes. Daniel Carter and Sophie Stanton sat in the back of his old pickup, parked on the side of a narrow road that led up one of the city's hills. The engine had long since died, and the cabin was silent except for their breathing and the occasional chirp of early birds outside the window. The air was cool, but inside the car, sparks of their emotions seemed to heat the space, creating an almost tangible tension. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her knees tucked up, a plastic cup of coffee she'd bought at an all-night gas station on the way here clutched in her hands. The steam from her drink was rising in thin wisps, but she wasn't drinking, just looking out the window, her profile sharp and fragile against the lightning sky. Her blonde hair, usually neatly pulled back, was now falling in loose waves around her shoulders, and there were dark shadows under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. Daniel, behind the wheel, looked no better. His face, lightly stubbled, was tired, but his eyes held the same focused determination as hers. In the back seat was a folder of statements and printouts that they'd discussed all night, but now those papers seemed distant, almost unreal, compared to what was happening between them. Sophie turned to him, her gaze soft but questioning. She set her cup down on the dashboard, her fingers shaking slightly as she gestured to the folder. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said, her voice quiet, almost broken. "All those details, That money, those messages, it's too dirty, Dan. I didn't mean for you to get so caught up in it. Daniel looked at her, his lips twisting into a bitter smile. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if seeking purchase. I had to know the truth, Sophie, he said, his voice hoarse but firm. For you, for me, for our future. And for you, he paused, his gaze growing serious. There's nothing left but the truth. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked back the tears. The words hung in the air, dissolving into the morning light that was now filtering through the pines, casting long shadows across the hood of the car. Sophie reached out slowly and touched his cheek, her fingers cold, but the touch burned like fire. Daniel froze, his breathing deepening, his heart beating faster, as if it were trying to escape his chest. There was tenderness in her gesture, but something deeper, a mixture of pain and hope and despair that connected them more deeply than either of them could have expected. Maybe we're crazy, she whispered, her voice shaking but sincere. She moved closer, her hand sliding down his cheek, lingering at his jawline. All of this, the revenge, the plans, the evidence, it's like we're drowning in it. But how else are we going to survive this pain, Dan? How are we going to live knowing what they did to us? Daniel turned his head, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment the world around them seemed to disappear. There were only them, two people whose lives had been torn apart by the same hands, but whose connection now extended beyond their shared purpose. He covered her hand with his own, his fingers warm and strong, the gesture a promise he hadn't yet dared to speak out loud. Sometimes the only way is to go against all odds, he said quietly, his voice thick with conviction. If we're going to be given a new life, Sophie, it's going to be together. We can't go back. But we can build something new, even if it hurts. She looked at him, her lips trembling, and for a moment there was a spark in her eyes, not just determination, but something more fragile, almost frightening. She moved even closer, her breath mixing with his, their faces so close he could see every lash, every shadow on her face. The air between them crackled with tension, like the air before a storm. This wasn't just attraction, it was something more, something born from their shared pain, but now threatening to grow into something they both feared and craved at the same time. Their lips met, cautiously at first, almost hesitantly, as if testing the limits of what was permissible. But then the kiss deepened, full of desperation and hope, as if they were trying to pour everything into him, their rage, their longing, their desire to live on. Sophie pressed herself against him, her arms sliding around his shoulders, and he held her tighter, as if afraid she would dissolve like the morning mist. There was nothing vengeful or calculating in that embrace, just two people who had found salvation in each other, however temporary. When they pulled away, their breathing was heavy, their eyes full of questions. Sophie hung her head, her fingers still clinging to the folds of his shirt, as if she were afraid to let go. "This is more than revenge, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what this is, Dan, but I feel like it's real." Daniel looked at her, his heart beating so loudly it seemed to drown out the morning birdsong. He wanted to say something smart, something that would make everything right, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded, his hand still on her waist, warm and comforting. "Yes," he said finally, "it's more. And it scares me, Sophie, but I don't want to run from it." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw his own doubts reflected. They both knew that their connection was more than just comfort, more than just a way to forget the pain. It was something new, fragile, but real, like the first ray of sunlight that was now breaking through the pine trees, bathing the truck in a soft glow. But it was also dangerous because it threatened to distract them from their plan, from their thirst for justice. Sophie sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as if she'd shed some of the weight she'd been carrying for weeks. "My marriage, it's been cold for a long time," she said, her voice quiet but bitter. "Rick, he wasn't the man I married, even before this whole thing with Emily started. He was distant, always busy, always with important things. I tried to save us, for Ella, for our family. But," she trailed off, her fingers tightening on the chain around her wrist, the same one Rick had given her all those years ago. I realized there was nothing left to save. He left me long before I found those messages. Daniel listened, his heart clenching at her words. He knew what he felt, the same emptiness, the same pain of knowing the person you loved was long gone. Emily, too, he began, his voice hoarse. She was my everything, Sophie. I built our lives around her, around the children. But now I see that she's gone too. Maybe not all at once, but gradually. I just didn't want to see it. They fell silent, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. The sun was rising higher, its light now spilling over the hills, erasing the last wisps of fog. Daniel looked at Sophie, at her tired but beautiful face, and felt something new begin to form within him, not just a desire for revenge, but a hope for something more. He didn't know what awaited them, but in this moment, in this car on this hill, he was sure of one thing. They would walk this path together. "We can't stop," he said finally, his voice firm but warm. "Not now, but I want you to know, Sophie, this isn't just revenge for me. You mean more." Sophie looked at him, her lips twitching into a small smile, the first real smile she'd seen in a long time. "You too, Dan," she said, "and that scares me, but I don't want to run either." They sat there for a moment, holding hands, until the sun rose above the horizon, bathing the world in light. Their plan for revenge was still in place, but now it was laced with something more, an emotion they dared not name, but which was already beginning to change them both. Dawn revealed a new reality, as inevitable as the betrayal that had created it, and they knew they were ready to face it. Dawn in Austin was sharp and unforgiving, a blade cutting through the morning fog over the city. The light pouring through Emily Carter's tall bedroom windows was cold, almost sterile, revealing every crack in her carefully constructed facade. She stood by the window, wrapped in an ivory silk robe that framed her figure softly. On her nightstand lay a lone photograph, worn by the winds of time, of her and Rick laughing against a sunset lake, their faces aglow with a carefreeness that had long since faded into reality. Her fingers, thin and nervous, clutched her glass of water as if it were an anchor, keeping her from falling into the abyss of her own thoughts. If I tell him this, it will only make things worse, she thought, her gaze wandering to the horizon where the city was slowly waking up. Emily had been dropping hints about divorce to Daniel for days. The words came out of her mouth, but each time they stuck in her throat, dissolving in the emptiness of their home. She rehearsed them in front of the mirror, in the car, in the solitude of the gallery where she worked, but each time her resolve melted under the weight of guilt and fear. She and Rick were made for each other, their passion, their secrets, their shared plans felt real to her, but at the same time they opposed each other, like two magnets whose power simultaneously attracts and repels. She knew that Daniel sensed her detachment, saw through her lies, but she could not bring herself to take the final step. "It is not yet time," a voice inside her whispered. "Not all is lost." That same morning, Daniel sat in his office, lost in the blueprints of a new project, a sketch of an apartment complex on the outskirts of Austin. His fingers mechanically moved the pencil across the paper, but his thoughts were far from the lines and angles. He had not slept for 2 nights, his mind captivated by the plan he was building with Sophie. The bugs planted in Rick's office and Emily's car had already begun to bear fruit, snippets of conversations, hints of new meetings, confirmations of their financial machinations. But the more he dug, the more he felt that his revenge was not only justice, but also a way to stay afloat, not to drown in the pain of betrayal. His phone vibrated, breaking him out of his thoughts. A text from Emily, "We need to talk." Simple words, dry as autumn leaves, but they hit him like lightning. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was both a relief and a threat. Emily knows something is wrong, he thought. Did she sense his coldness, his distance? Or worse, did she suspect he knew the truth? He put the phone down, his heart racing, but he forced himself to breathe evenly. This was his chance to buy her time, to keep her in the dark until his and Sophie's plan was ready. He returned home that evening, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of their spacious living room. Emily was waiting for him in the kitchen, wearing a new silk blouse with no buttons that fell off her shoulders, revealing her collarbone. She looked like a painting, perfect but cold, as if her beauty were designed to distract rather than attract. She poured herself a glass of wine, her movements fluid but nervous. Daniel dropped his briefcase on the couch and walked toward her, his gaze heavy but trying to hide the storm inside. "We need to talk," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of challenge. She turned to him, her eyes searching for a reaction, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I'm not sure we're on the right track, Dan. We've grown apart. You can feel that, can't you?" Daniel looked at her, his face unreadable, but inside he was seething. Distanced, he wanted to scream in her face, remind her of her nights with Rick, of her lies, of her betrayal. But he held back. He knew this was no time for emotion. He had to play his part to buy himself time. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, his voice calm, almost tired. "We're both busy, the kids, work, but I don't want to give up, Emily. Let's try again. For Lily and Max. For us." Her eyes widened, confusion flickering briefly, but she quickly hid it behind a smile, the same one that had once made his heart beat faster, but now seemed like a mask. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice light but wary. I thought you felt like everything had changed, too." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze hard but with a false warmth. "I feel it," he said, his voice lower. "But I don't want to lose our family. Let's give ourselves a chance, Emily. We can do this." She nodded, her smile widening, but there was a glint in her eyes, not passion, but something else, something like protest mixed with fear. "Okay," she said, "let's try it." But Daniel could see that she was lying. Her words were as empty as her promises. He turned to the table where his plans lay and pretended to go back to work. "Are you happy with Rick?" he asked suddenly, without looking up from the paper, his voice even but with an undercurrent of menace. Emily froze, the hand holding her glass shaking. She laughed, but it was strained. "Okay?" she asked, her voice higher, almost playful. "Not bad at all. He's a good friend, Dan. You know that." Daniel nodded, not looking up. "I know," he said, and there was more in that word than she could understand. He knew everything, every word she said, every move she made, every lie she told, and he was going to use it against her. Meanwhile, miles away, Rick Stanton sat in his office, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. He'd just gotten off a call with yet another business associate, discussing a new contract that was going to make him millions and further cement his secret plan with Emily. But something was wrong. He'd been noticing oddities for the past few days. The empty coffee shop where he usually met clients, now filled with unfamiliar faces, a car in the parking lot that shouldn't have been there, Sophie's eyes, too intent, too sharp. And Daniel, his best friend, had become distant, his answers short, his smiles empty. This morning, Rick had seen Sophie and Daniel leaving the Old Oak Cafe, the same abandoned place he had thought was empty. They were walking close, too close, and there was a tense synchronicity to their movements, like people bound by a secret. The doubts he had tried to push away were now rippling through his nerves in sticky ripples, making his heart beat faster. Something was happening, he thought. Something he didn't understand. That evening, he couldn't resist dialing Daniel's number. The phone rang for a long time, and when Daniel finally answered, his voice was dry, almost lifeless. "Everything okay, Dan?" Rick asked, trying to sound casual, but his tone betrayed his concern. "You seem kind of distant." "Yeah," Daniel said, and the word hit him like a blow. Short, cold, and devoid of warmth. "It's okay, Rick. Just busy." Rick clutched the phone, his lips forming a thin line. "Okay," he said, his voice sharper. "If anything happens, you know where to find me." "I know," Daniel said, and there was a hint of a smile in his voice, not a friendly one, but one that hides a storm. He hung up, leaving Rick in the quiet of his office, where doubts were now louder than the hum of the air conditioner. Daniel put his phone down and looked at the plans in front of him. His heart was beating steadily, but inside him, confidence was growing. Emily wanted a divorce. Rick was starting to get suspicious the game was getting more dangerous, but he was ready. He and Sophie were ready. Their plan for revenge was gaining momentum, and now that their enemies were starting to feel threatened, there was no turning back. It was a gray morning in Austin, with low clouds that seemed to weigh the city down, adding to the claustrophobic feeling that had gripped Sophie Stanton. She sat in the office of an architecture firm, surrounded by stacks of papers and folders that smelled of old dust and fresh ink. The fluorescent lights reflected off her tired face, dark shadows under her eyes, and her hair, usually neatly pulled back, was now escaping from its messy bun. The office was empty. Rick was away at a client meeting, and Daniel had promised to stop by later. Sophie took advantage of the rare moment of solitude to pore over the documents that might be their trump card against Rick and Emily. Her fingers, nervous and cold, shuffled through the folders until they came upon one, unmarked, tucked into the far corner of the cabinet. She opened it, and her heart skipped a beat. Inside were contracts for major construction projects, invoices, bank statements, all neatly organized but with one common denominator: Rick's signature, his initials, his footprint. She read the documents, her eyes darting from line to line, picking out words like transfer, offshore, dummy account. The amounts were staggering: hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from their firm, funneled into Rick's personal accounts through a maze of shell companies. Every signature, every number, was the seal of his betrayal, not just personal but professional, one that was destroying not just their marriages, but the business she and Daniel had built together. Sophie turned the last page, her fingers shaking so badly the paper almost slipped out. At the bottom, scrawled in his hand, as if Rick had written it in a hurry: left for his own gain, used the trust of a lifetime. She didn't know if it was his own reflection or mockery, but the words hit her like a slap. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, her vision clouded, but the tears didn't come, replaced by a cold, almost tangible fury. She pressed her ear to the wall of the hallway, her heart pounding, as if someone might burst in and catch her off guard. But beyond the wall, there was only silence, pierced by her own breathing. Sophie clutched the folder in her hands, her nails digging into the cardboard. She knew the trial was only a short time away. These documents were their weapons, their ticket to justice. That same morning, miles from his office, Daniel Carter sat in the living room of his house, surrounded by a silence that seemed louder than any noise. On the coffee table in front of him lay an open envelope, its edges slightly wrinkled, as if he had been hesitant to open it right away. Inside was a postcard from the lab, the results of a DNA test he had ordered a week ago, on an impulse that was a mixture of paranoia and desperation. His fingers, usually sure, were shaking as he unfolded the paper. The numbers stared back at him, dry and pitiless, but his gaze was caught on one line: probability of paternity, 0%. His daughter, Lily, his little girl with her tinkling laugh and habit of falling asleep with a stuffed bunny, was not his. The world he knew had been fractured once again, and this time the crack was deeper than he could bear. He sat still, his eyes glued to the paper, but he couldn't see it. Memories flashed before his eyes: holding Lily in his arms at the hospital, teaching her to ride a bike, drawing him crooked hearts on Father's Day. It had all been a lie, not hers, but Emily's. His wife, the woman he trusted with his life, had kept the truth from him, a truth that was now rewriting their past. He clenched the paper in his fist, crumpling it, but it didn't bring relief. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could barely hear Emily's faint voice coming from the hallway. "Is everything okay?" she asked, standing in the doorway. Her voice was soft, but there was a wariness to it, as if she knew something was wrong but didn't dare ask directly. Daniel nodded automatically, his face unreadable, but inside he was screaming. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse, almost alien. He pocketed the paper without looking at her and stood up, pretending to go back to his drawings. Emily hesitated, her eyes searching for him, but she did not press him. She walked into the kitchen, her footsteps fading, leaving him alone with the new truth. He sank into a chair, his hands shaking and his mind in disarray. Everything he believed in, everything that had kept him going, his family, his daughter, had been an illusion. Emily's betrayal now had a face as well as a name, and that face was the face of his child, who had turned out not to be his. He wanted to give up on everything, his plan with Sophie, their revenge, their fight. Why continue when everything he had lived for had been a lie? He felt his resolve crumbling, the walls he had built around his pain beginning to crack at the seams. But then his phone vibrated, snapping him out of his spiral of despair. A text from Sophie. Found something. This is the end for Rick. Come to the cafe now. Daniel stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't want to go. He wanted to lock himself in his office, get drunk, forget about everything. But something in her words, their laconic power, made him stand up. Sophie. She was his anchor, his ally, his reflection. He couldn't let her down, not now. An hour later, he was sitting across from her in the abandoned old oak cafe where they had met last time. Sophie looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright with triumph. She pushed a folder of documents toward him, her voice quiet but determined. "This is it, Dan," she said. "The contracts, the invoices, the wires. Rick didn't just sleep with Emily. He stole everything from us, our firm, our trust, our lives. These papers are our ticket to victory. We can destroy him." Daniel stared at the folder, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt his heart tighten, the pain of the DNA test mixed with the rage of new discoveries. "Sophie," he began, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "I don't know if I can go on. Today, I found out Lily isn't my daughter. Emily, she's been lying to me this whole time. I don't know what this is all about." Sophie froze, her eyes widening, and for a moment there was a flash of the same pain he'd seen in the mirror that morning. She reached across the table, her fingers gripping his wrist, firm but gentle. "Dan," she said, her voice strong despite the trembling. "I know how much this hurts. I know how much it feels to quit, to hide, to forget. But you can't. Not now. We've come too far. Rick and Emily destroyed us, but we won't let them win. Lily, she's still your daughter, Dan. Not by blood, maybe, but by love. And you have to fight for her, for Max, for yourself, and for me." Her words, simple but sincere, pierced his despair like a ray of light through clouds. He looked at her tired but determined face, and felt his own resolve slowly returning. Sophie was right. He couldn't stop, not now. Not for revenge, but to reclaim his life, his truth, his future. "You're right," he said finally, his voice firmer. "We'll finish this, together." Sophie nodded, her fingers still clutching his. "Together," she repeated, and there was a vow in the word that bound them together more tightly than their shared pain. They sat in the silence of the cafe, surrounded by papers and shadows, but they were not alone now. Their crisis, their discoveries, their wounds had only strengthened their alliance. Rick and Emily thought they had the game in hand, but they didn't know that their opponents had just found a new reason to fight. It was a hot afternoon in Austin, the air thick with the scent of hot asphalt and blooming magnolias. The sun was high, bathing the city in a blinding light that seemed to reveal every secret hidden in the shadows. Emily Carter sat in her car, parked outside the gallery where she worked as a curator. Her fingers gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles were white, and the screen glowed like a warning light. The text from an unknown number was terse but devastating, a link to a cloud storage service that contained documents that exposed Rick's dealings, contracts for fictitious construction projects, lists of shell companies, wire transfers that siphoned money from their architecture firm into his personal accounts. Each file was signed with his initials, each transaction with his digital signature. This was not just dirt, but proof that her lover, the man for whom she had risked her marriage, was using her just as he had used Daniel and Sophie. Emily stared at the screen, her breath coming in short gasps, a mixture of anger and humiliation building in her chest. I knew Rick wasn't who he seemed, she thought, her lips pressed into a thin line. She remembered his confident smiles, his promises, his words about building a new life together. But now it all seemed like a script for an elaborate play, with her as the pawn. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, her nails digging into the soft skin, but she didn't notice the pain. The voice in her head screamed for answers, but her heart already knew the truth. She was being lied to, she was being used, Her love was a coin in someone else's game. She threw the phone on the passenger seat and started the car, her thoughts a mess, but one thing was clear: she had to talk to Rick. Right now. Meanwhile, in the luxurious mansion in the Austin Hills, where Sophie and Rick had lived for the past 5 years, the silence was broken only by the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor. Sophie stood in her bedroom, her suitcase open on the bed, next to a neatly folded pile of dresses, books, and a box of Ella's childhood drawings. Her wedding ring, the massive diamond Rick had given her with such pomp that she felt like the heroine of a romantic movie, glittered on the nightstand. Now the piece of metal felt heavy as a shackle. She slipped it off her finger, her movements slow, almost ritualistic, and placed it on the table next to the legal divorce papers. The paper was filled with her careful signature, each letter a step toward liberation. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice shaking but no tears coming. She looked at the ring, the document, the empty room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt relief. It was bitter, mixed with pain, but it was real. Rick, his shadow, his lies, all of it was behind her, dissolving into the doorway through which she would soon walk forever. She knew this step would change everything for her, for Ella, for their future. But she was ready. A new path, though still unclear, was already emerging, and it led to a light that she hoped would burn away the darkness of her past. That same morning, Daniel Carter sat in his office in their home, surrounded by blueprints and sketches that now seemed as empty as his life. His laptop was open, the screen glowing, showing the folder of dirt on Rick, the same one he'd accidentally left open the night before, knowing Emily would come into his office to retrieve her papers. It had been his move, his way of pushing her over the edge, of forcing her to see the truth about Rick without revealing that he knew. He wanted her to panic, to let her world, like his, crumble under the weight of a lie. Emily walked into the house around noon, her steps sharp, almost furious. She dropped her bag on the couch and headed for the office, her face pale, her eyes blazing with anger. Daniel heard her footsteps and pretended to be absorbed in his work, but his heart was beating faster as he caught her stop at his desk out of the corner of his eye. Her gaze fell on the laptop screen, where a folder of files was still open, screenshots of Rick's text messages, bank statements, contracts with shell companies. She froze, her breathing heavy, her hands clenched into fists. "What is this, Dan?" she asked, her voice sharp, almost accusing, but there was panic in it. "What are these files on your computer?" Daniel looked up slowly, his face unreadable, but inside he was elated. She took the bait. He shrugged, feigning confusion. "Oh, this," he said, his voice calm, almost indifferent. "Just some work papers. Something I found when I was checking the firm's books. Why do you ask?" Emily stepped closer, her eyes narrowing and her lips trembling. "These aren't just documents," she said, her voice rising, almost breaking. This is about Rick, right? Are you spying on him? On us?" Daniel looked at her, his gaze cold, but he forced a smile, a small, almost sympathetic one. "Spy? Emily, I'm just doing my job. If you see something that bothers you, maybe you should talk to Rick." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Or do you have something you want to tell me?" Her face paled even more, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck. She knew he knew, or at least suspected. But she couldn't admit it, couldn't destroy the lie that was now falling apart. It's nothing," she finally managed, her voice weak, almost pleading. "Just forget it." She turned and walked out of the office, her steps quick, almost panicked. Daniel watched her go, his heart beating steadily, but inside he could feel their game picking up speed. Emily had seen the dirt, and now her world was beginning to crumble just like his hand when he learned the truth. But he wasn't going to stop. This was just the first step. Later that day, Emily called Rick, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "We need to meet," she said, her words as sharp as punches. "Now, I know what you did. I know about the money, the bills, everything." Rick, sitting in his office, felt his stomach clench. He tried to reassure her, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. "Emily, what are you talking about?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. "What money? What did you see?" "Don't lie to me," she screamed, her voice breaking. "I saw the files, Rick. You used me, you used the firm, you used Daniel. How could you?" The conversation ended in shouting and accusations, their words like sparks igniting a fire that now threatened to engulf them both. Emily hung up, her hands shaking, the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilling out. She didn't know what to do: run to Daniel, beg for forgiveness, or confront Rick and demand answers. But one thing was clear: her lies, her secrets, her love, all of it was now at risk. At the same time, Sophie sat in her law office, handing over divorce papers to her lawyer. The woman across from her was calm and professional, her pen running quickly over the papers, marking key points. "Are you sure, Mrs. Stanton?" she asked, her voice even but with a hint of sympathy. "This is a big step." Sophie nodded, her eyes dry but determined. "I'm sure," she said. "I want this to end. I want my daughter and I to start a new life without him." The lawyer nodded, closing the folder. "Okay, we'll file the documents today, and given the evidence you've provided, you have every chance of a favorable outcome." Sophie walked out of the office, her steps firm, but inside she felt her heart clench. She had taken the first step toward freedom, but she knew there was a storm ahead. Rick wouldn't go down without a fight, and Emily was a ticking time bomb now. But Sophie wasn't afraid. She knew Daniel was there, and their shared plan, their shared pain, connected them more than anything else. That evening she called Daniel, her voice calm but full of strength. "I filed for divorce," she said. "It's all over. What about you? How are things with Emily?" Daniel stood at his living room window, watching the sunset turn the sky blood red. "She saw the files," he said. "She's panicking. And Rick, he's starting to get suspicious too. We're close, Sophie. Very close." "Then don't stop," she said, her voice like a vow. "We'll finish this. Together." Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Their game had become more dangerous, but they were ready. Emily and Rick thought they had everything under control, but they didn't know that their fake game had already been exposed, and now it was their opponent's turn to make a move. The week in Austin had been one of turmoil, and for Rick Stanton, it had been a series of disasters, each more acute than the last. The CFOs of their architecture firm circled his offices like vultures, methodically uncovering the machinations he had hidden for so long. Each new audit was like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile facade of his life. Documents he had thought were safely hidden were surfacing one after another: contracts to shell companies, transfers to offshore accounts, doctored reports signed in his own hand. All of it now lay on the desks of auditors whose eyes, cold and impartial, left him with no chance of justifying himself. Rick sat in his office, once a symbol of his success, now a cage where he felt like a cornered animal. Outside, Austin was drowning in the silence of the night. The city's hum did not reach this high floor, where only the light from the computer screen illuminated his face, pale and haggard. He reread the letter from the audit committee, dry, formal, but with deadly clarity listing his violations. Financial irregularities, suspected fraud, possible liability. Each word was like a nail being driven into the lid of his career. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, leaving red marks. "This is a mistake," he told himself, but the numbers on the screen did not lie. The firm's debt was growing. Loyal partners who had once admired his charisma were now turning away, and rumors of dismissal were spreading through the office corridors like toxic smoke. He knew it was no accident. Someone was digging under him, and digging well. Rick remembered the look in Daniel's eyes the last time they met, cold, distant, but with a shadow of something he couldn't decipher. And Sophie, her sudden coldness, her departure from their home in the hills, her refusal to answer her calls. He felt the circle tightening, but he couldn't figure out who was pulling the strings. His mind swung between paranoia and despair, but he still clung to the hope that he could wriggle out of it like he had before. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter sat in his office in a house that now felt like a stranger to him. In front of him lay the documents his lawyer had prepared, a formal proposal to split the business. He knew it would be a painful step, but a necessary one. The firm he and Rick had built from scratch had been their baby, but now it had become a battleground. Daniel was not about to let Rick drag it down with his machinations. He had spent the last few days consulting with lawyers, gathering evidence that would prove his right to control the firm. The documents Sophie had found were their trump card. They proved that Rick had not only cheated them in their personal lives, but had also systematically stolen their business. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He felt both victorious and defeated. Splitting the business meant the end of an era, the end of the dream he and Rick had shared as young men, sitting over beers and sketching plans on napkins. But he knew it was the only way to protect himself, his family, his future. He looked at the photo of Lily and Max on the table, their smiles, their innocence, the only thing keeping him going. Even after the DNA test showed that Lily wasn't his biological daughter, he couldn't stop loving her. She was his, and he was going to fight for her, even if it meant destroying everything that tied him to the past. That evening, Sophie stood in the office parking lot, her car parked beneath an old oak tree whose branches cast long shadows in the streetlights. She waited for Rick, knowing he would be late leaving the office. He always did when things went badly. Her purse was on the passenger seat, and in it was a copy of the divorce papers she had filed the day before. The decision was final, and despite the pain that still clenched her heart, she felt relief. She was no longer Rick Stanton's wife. She was Sophie, the woman who had chosen herself, and her daughter, Ella, over the lies that had kept her caged. When Rick left the building, his steps were heavy and his face was gray, as if he already knew his world was falling apart. He spotted Sophie immediately, her silhouette in the lantern light like a ghost from the past. She stepped forward, her eyes cold but determined. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but with a strength he hadn't expected. Rick stopped, his gaze darting to her hands, clutching the folder. "What is it, Sophie?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving," she said, her words like a gunshot in the quiet parking lot. "I'm filing for divorce, Rick. It's over. You ruined us, and I'm not going to be a part of your game anymore." He took a step toward her, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and panic. "Sophie, wait," he began, his voice growing louder. "This is a mistake. We can fix this. You know I love you, that Ella—" "Don't you dare mention Ella," she interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "You used us, Rock. Me, Daniel, our firm. I know about your accounts, your deals, Emily. I know everything." His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just been punched. "Who told you?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Daniel, it was him, wasn't it? What did he tell you?" Sophie shook her head, her lips twisting into a bitter smile. "Not Daniel," she said. "Really, she always finds a way, Rick, and now she's found you." She turned and walked toward her car, leaving him standing in the parking lot, his figure small and lost in the light of the streetlights. Rick watched her go, his hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. He knew this was the end not just of his marriage, but of everything he'd built. The rumors of his dismissal that had already been buzzing around the office now seemed inevitable. His partners, his clients, his reputation all were crumbling, and he couldn't stop it. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his office, signing the final paperwork to split up the business. His lawyer, an older man with tired eyes, nodded, closing the file. "It won't be easy, Mr. Carter," he said, "but with this evidence, you have every chance of taking control of the firm. Mr. Stanton won't be able to argue." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the window where the Austin night was aglow. He felt both drained and empowered. Dividing the business had been his final step toward breaking free of Rick, but he knew it was only the beginning. Sophie had left Rick, and now he was alone, not just without a wife, but without allies. Emily, judging by her panic, was on edge too. His plan with Sophie had worked, but the cost had been high. Later that night, Daniel received a text from Sophie. "I did it. The divorce is filed. He knows." He read it from his window and felt his heart clench. They were close, but he knew Rick wasn't going down without a fight. And Emily was their next target. Their game was getting more dangerous, but Daniel and Sophie were ready. They knew Rick was going down, but they were going to make sure he didn't get up. The Austin evening was muggy, the air heavy with the scent of approaching rain. The Carter house was silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards and the distant hum of traffic outside. Emily Carter stood in the kitchen, her fingers clutching the old maple table where their family had once gathered Daniel, she, Lily, and Max. Now the table bore witness to her desperation, her last attempt to hold on to something that was slipping away. In front of her was a photograph of their wedding, she in a white dress, he in a suit, their smiles bright with a hope that now seemed like a ghost. Her hand shook as she moved the picture toward Daniel, who stood at the sink with a glass of water, his eyes distant, almost absent. "Dan, please," she began, her voice shaking, tears already streaming down her cheeks, leaving dark trails of mascara. "I never stopped loving you. Everything that happened was a mistake. We can start over. For the kids, for us." Daniel looked at the photograph, his eyes slowly moving over the faded image, but his face remained unreadable. A storm raged inside him, anger, pain, weariness from her lies, but he held himself back, knowing that every word, every gesture was now part of their game. He knew everything, her affair with Rick, her betrayal, her secret about Lily, which he had confirmed with a DNA test. He recorded her conversations, her meetings, her confessions, caught by the bugs he and Sophie had planted. But he remained silent, letting her drown in her own words, in her desperate attempt to save what she had destroyed. "I know," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost soft, but there was steel in it. He wasn't looking at her, his gaze fixed on the photograph, as if searching for traces of the woman he had once loved. But she wasn't there. The Emily who stood before him was different, a woman whose promises were empty, whose tears were merely an attempt at manipulation. Her eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear flickering in them. You believe me?" she asked, her voice hoarse, almost pleading. She took a step closer, her hands reaching out to him, but he pulled back, barely noticeable, the gesture like a blow. "I said I knew," he repeated, his tone colder. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the photograph and her tears. Emily watched him go, her chest heaving with sobs she could no longer hold back. She sank into a chair, her fingers clutching the photograph, crumpling its edges. She wanted to scream, to beg, to run after him, but something in his silence, in his gaze, stopped her. He knew. She could feel it, but she couldn't understand how deep his knowledge went. Daniel walked into the living room, his steps heavy but sure. He picked up a book from the shelf, an old, tattered copy of The Great Gatsby that he and Emily had read together in the early years of their marriage. But he hadn't meant to read it. It was just an excuse to leave, to escape her despair, which now seemed as false as a stage play. He sat in the chair, his fingers turning the pages, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Sophie, about their plan, about how close they had come. Rick was on the brink of collapse, his company was falling apart, and Sophie had officially filed for divorce. Emily, Emily was next. But her tears, her pleas, touched something inside him, some old wound he had thought had healed long ago. He hated himself for it, for still feeling anything for her, even if it was only a shadow of his former love. Time passed slowly, filling their home with a silence that was louder than words. Emily stayed in the kitchen, her gaze wandering over the empty walls where family photos had once hung. She caught every sound, every rustle, hoping that Daniel would come back, say something that would give her a chance. But he never did. At night, she saw his silhouette in the doorway of the bedroom where they had once slept in each other's arms, sharing dreams and laughter. Now he stood there, looking at the empty bed, and she knew that he saw not her, but the past she had destroyed. "Why don't you speak?" she whispered one night when they bumped into each other at the bedroom door, their hands almost touching, but he turned away. Her voice was weak, almost broken, but there was no answer. Only the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway and the quiet hum of the cars outside the window, a reminder of the world that went on while theirs was crumbling. Emily walked back into the bedroom, her steps heavy, as if she was carrying the weight of her guilt on her shoulders. She lay down on the bed, her fingers clutching the pillow that still smelled of his cologne. She wanted to save their marriage, she wanted to win his love back, but every look he gave her, every silence he gave her, told her it was too late. She didn't know he'd recorded her conversations with Rick, that he knew about Lily, that his silence wasn't weakness, but a weapon he was holding in reserve. She didn't know that every attempt she made to win him back only brought her closer to the abyss. That same night, a few miles away from their home, Sophie sat in her new apartment, a small but cozy one she'd rented for herself and Ella. Her daughter was asleep in the next room, her breathing even, and Sophie sat at the kitchen table, rereading the divorce papers. She knew she'd made the right choice, but that didn't make it any less painful. She called Daniel, her voice tired but determined. "How are you, Dan?" she asked, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. "Emily, does she suspect something?" Daniel, still sitting in the living room, looked down at the book in his hands. "She's trying to fix everything," he said, his voice quiet but bitter. "Confessions, tears, romance. But I know the truth, Sophie. I know about Lily, and I wrote down everything she said to Rick. She doesn't know that I'm ready." Sophie nodded, though he couldn't see her. "We're close," she said. "Rick's falling, Emily's on the edge. But be careful, Dan. She could be dangerous if she knows you know." "I know," he said, his voice firmer. "But I won't stop. Not now." They said goodbye, and Daniel put his phone down. He looked out the window, where it was starting to rain, the drops pounding the glass like a metronome counting down to their final move. Emily thought she could save their marriage, but she didn't know that her confessions, her pleas, were just fuel for his resolve. He was silent, but his silence was louder than any words. It was a promise that the truth would come out soon, and then she would have nowhere to run. The Austin sun was high, flooding the courthouse with light that filtered through the tall windows and reflected off the polished wood benches. The courtroom was tense and quiet, except for the rustling of papers, the whispers of lawyers, and the occasional creak of chairs. The air smelled of cheap coffee from the vending machine down the hall, and something else fierce, as heavy and tangible as summer heat. Daniel Carter sat on one side of the room, his back straight, his eyes cold and focused. Across the aisle, Rick Stanton looked like a man whose world was crumbling, his face pale, his eyes darting, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his jacket. Between them, like an invisible wall, lay months of lies, betrayals, and carefully gleaned evidence, now laid out before the judge. Emily Carter sat in the front row, her hands fiddling with the corner of the navy dress she'd chosen to appear discreet, but her eyes were raging. She glanced from Daniel to Rick, trying to figure out how things had gotten this far. Sophie Stanton sat a little further back, her expression calm but her posture determined. She held a folder of documents that had become her and Daniel's greatest weapons: bank statements, contracts, conversational records, everything that exposed Rick's dealings and his affair with Emily. These papers, pieced together, now sat on the judge's desk, their truth louder than any excuse. The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a stern expression, rapped his gavel, calling the hearing open. His voice was even, but there was a sense of the gravity of the moment in it. "Case number 47219, he began, leafing through a file. "The divorce between Daniel Carter and Emily Carter, and between Sophie Stanton and Rick Stanton. In addition, there is a division of the assets of the architectural firm Carter and Stanton and allegations of financial impropriety. I asked the attorneys to present their arguments." Daniel stared straight ahead as his attorney, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, began to lay out their case. She spoke clearly, her words like hammer blows. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Carter, has presented irrefutable evidence of financial fraud committed by Mr. Stanton. Transfers to shell accounts, fictitious contracts, the use of firm assets for personal gain, all supported by documents, correspondence, and records. In addition, Mr. Carter seeks divorce on the grounds of adultery and requests a paternity test for his daughter, Lily Carter. Rick turned even paler. His lawyer, a young man with a nervous smile, tried to object, but his arguments sounded weak, as if he himself did not believe in his words. "My client denies the charges of fraud," he began, but the judge raised his hand, stopping him. "The documents speak for themselves," the judge said, his voice dry but firm. "I have reviewed the evidence presented. Mr. Stanton, do you have anything to say?" Rick opened his mouth, but his words were as empty as the wind. "It's a mistake, Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking. I can explain. These were temporary transfers for projects. I never meant to hurt the firm or my family." But his excuses vanished into thin air, drowned out by the weight of the evidence. In the audience, Sophie leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Rick. She saw his weakness, his fear, and it gave her strength. She knew this moment was the culmination of her and Daniel's plan. They had not just exposed his betrayal, but his greed, his betrayal that had destroyed not only their families, but their cause. Emily, called to the stand, rose from her seat, her steps unsteady as she forced herself to approach the stand. Her voice shook as she spoke, her eyes finding Daniel every now and then, but he was staring straight ahead, giving her no sign of forgiveness. I admit I made a mistake," she said, her words barely audible. "I loved Daniel, I still love him. But Rick, he deceived me just like he deceived them. I didn't know about his deals, about the money. I thought, I thought he loved me." Her voice broke, and she fell silent, her gaze falling on Rick, who was now looking under the table as if he could hide from her words. Emily felt her heart breaking with shame, with pain, with the knowledge that her love had been built on a lie. But she continued, her voice firmer, "I want Daniel to know that I'm sorry. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want him to know the truth." Daniel didn't move, his face unreadable, but inside he felt her words digging into him like needles. He knew the truth, he knew about her affair with Rick. He knew about Lily, he knew her every move, recorded on the bugs he'd planted. But he stayed silent, letting her talk, letting her drown in her own guilt. This was his revenge, not screaming, not accusations, but a cold, calculating silence that spoke louder than any words. The judge sighed, his fingers tapping the pencil on the table. He flipped through a few more pages, his gaze hard but fair. "Based on the evidence presented," he began, his voice booming across the courtroom, "I declare the following. The divorces between Daniel Carter and Emily Carter, and between Sophie Stanton and Rick Stanton, are hereby granted. Mrs. Stanton is granted full custody of her daughter, Ella Stanton, with limited supervised visitation for Rick Stanton. As for the firm of Carter and Stanton, the assets will be divided, with primary control given to Mr. Carter due to proven financial impropriety on Mr. Stanton's part. Additionally, Mr. Carter is entitled to have a paternity test performed on Lily Carter, as requested in his request." Emily gasped, her hand going to her chest as if she could stop the pain that shot through her at those words. She looked at Daniel, her eyes full of horror, but he didn't meet her gaze. He knew the paternity test would be the final nail in the coffin of her lie, and he was ready for it. Across the room, Rick's head hung, his shoulders slumped like a man who had just lost everything. His company, his family, his reputation, everything he'd spent years building, all gone in an instant. Sophie, hearing the judge's decision, felt her chest fill with air. She felt like she hadn't breathed in months. Full custody of Ella was her victory, her release. She looked at Daniel, and their eyes met. She saw the same determination in his, the same pain, but also relief. They had done it. They had destroyed Rick's world, and now it was Emily's turn. After the hearing, Emily received the official divorce notice handed to her by Daniel's lawyer in the courtroom hallway. Her hand shook as she opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the words, but the words blurred before her eyes. She knew it was the end, but she still clung to the hope that she could make things right. She walked up to Daniel, who stood at the exit of the building, his frame as rigid as a rock. "Dan, please," she began, her voice weak, almost pleading. "Can we talk? I know you're angry, but—" "That's enough, Emily," he interrupted, his voice cold but calm. "I know everything. About Rick, about the money, about Lily. The paternity test is just a formality. You lost me a long time ago, and now you're losing everything else." She froze, her eyes widening, and for a moment she looked like someone who had just been punched. You knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This whole time?" Daniel didn't answer. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving her alone with her summons and her shattered hopes. Sophie was waiting for him by the car, her face tired but her eyes bright with victory. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Now, Emily." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was already setting. "Now, Emily," he repeated. Their war was not over, but this day, this Judgment Day, was their triumph. Rick had lost everything, and Emily was on the brink. He and Sophie knew their next move would be decisive, and they were ready to make it. The night in Austin was soft and warm, as if the city were trying to comfort those who wandered its streets in search of answers. Candles burned in Daniel Carter's house, their flickering light casting long shadows on the living room walls where old photographs still hung, fragments of a past that now seemed alien. Sophie Stanton walked quietly through the back door, her footsteps almost silent on the hardwood floor. She paused in the living room doorway, her silhouette softly outlined by the candlelight, her eyes reflecting a mixture of weariness, determination, and something else of fragile hope that still lingered despite everything they had been through. Daniel stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkness where the lights of the city flickered like distant stars. A melody played softly on the old record player he hadn't turned on in years, a violin cry intertwined with the soft sound of waves recorded on a vinyl record. The music filled the space, creating the illusion of a world that no longer existed. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and their eyes met. There were no words in that look, but there was everything: pain, forgiveness, a love that had been born from their shared struggle and was now fading like those candles burning low on the table. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice hoarse but warm. "You came." She nodded, her lips twitching in a small smile. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye," she said, her voice barely audible but strong. She stepped closer, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her scarf. "Tomorrow, I'm leaving for Seattle. With Ella, a new life, but I wanted to see you. One last time." Daniel looked at her, his heart clenching at her words. They stood face to face, only a few steps apart, but the distance between them felt both close and insurmountable. Their bond, born of revenge, had grown into something more: a love that was both a salvation and a burden. He held out his hand, and she placed hers in his, their fingers intertwined as if they were trying to hold on to the fleeting moment. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered, her eyes shining in the candlelight. I loved you, Dan. Maybe not the way I should have, but it was real." He nodded, his throat tight, but he forced himself to speak. "I loved you too, Sophie," he said, his voice full of regret. "But maybe we chose the wrong path. We were too broken to build anything new." She smiled, her smile bitter but sincere. "Maybe," she agreed, "but you gave me strength. You helped me get out of that hell. And for that, I will always be grateful." They fell silent, letting the music do the talking. Daniel took a step closer, and they began to dance slowly, their movements cautious, almost hesitant, as if they were afraid to ruin the fragile moment. Their bodies moved in unison, their breaths mingled, and each touch was a farewell to what they could have been. The candlelight flickered, casting their shadows on the walls, and in this dance they tried to catch the fleeting shadow of a morning that would never be their dawn. When the record ended, the needle clicked softly, and silence enveloped them like a warm blanket. Sophie leaned against him, her cheek brushing his chest, and for a moment they were still, their hearts beating in unison. She lifted her head, her eyes full of tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for comforting me, for showing me I could be stronger." Daniel leaned down and brushed his lips across her forehead, his kiss light but warm. "You've always been strong, Sophie," he said. "I just helped you see that." They pulled away, their hands slowly unclasping, and that moment would be their last. Sophie stepped toward the door, her fingers lingering on the handle as if she wanted to turn back. But she knew she couldn't. She turned to him one last time, her eyes full of light, not candlelight, but the light born of her new resolve. "Remember to live, Dan," she said. "For yourself, for the children." He nodded, his throat tight, but he didn't answer. She was gone, her footsteps fading into the night, and Daniel was alone, surrounded by the dying candles and the silence that now seemed louder than any music. He knew that this was their last night, their last dance, and that different paths lay ahead. But in that moment, he felt that their revenge, their pain, their love, had all been worth it. They had found salvation in each other, if only for a short time. The next morning came with rain pounding the rooftops of Austin, washing away the traces of the night. Emily Carter sat on the threshold of her garden, her hair wet but unaware. Her home, once full of laughter and warmth, was now as empty as her heart. Daniel was gone, taking Lily and Max, and though the court had given her permission to see the children, she knew their family would never be the same. She looked out at the lawn where her children had once played Lily with her dolls, Max with his toy soldier, and now those memories were like a knife stabbing into her chest. The sun was breaking through the clouds, its warmth as unrequited as her attempts to recapture the past. Emily clutched the letter from her lawyer, the final divorce decree and paternity test. She knew the truth about Lily had come out, and it had crushed the last vestiges of hope she had. She sat in a silence that was as toxic as her own mistakes. But in that silence, in that loneliness, she began to see a glimmer of something new, not forgiveness, not redemption, but a lesson that life had taught her with brutal honesty. She had lost everything: love, family, herself. But in that fall, she began to see that she could start over, albeit from scratch. Daniel drove through the wet streets of Austin, his truck rocking gently to the rhythm of the rain. Max was asleep in the back seat, his head on a pillow, a bag of Lily's toys lying next to him, staying with her grandmother for the weekend. His briefcase, soaked from the rain, held court papers, the division of the company, the divorce, custody of the kids. But the heaviest burden wasn't the papers, it was his own heart, still aching from Emily's betrayal and the truth about Lily. He looked in the rearview mirror at his sleeping son and felt tears welling up in his eyes. But he didn't let them fall. He was a father, and that was his promise to be strong for them. At home, he paused at the door, his gaze falling on the family photo on the wall. Him, Emily, Lily, and Max, their smiles unbreakable, as if they could stop time. He whispered softly, "I live for you now." His words were a vow, a promise he was going to keep, no matter what. A few months later, Sophie sat in her new apartment in Seattle, a suburb where the air smelled of pine and the sea. Her life had changed. The small but cozy apartment had become her sanctuary, a place where she and Ella could begin anew. Ella played in the next room, her laughter like music that drowned out the echoes of the past. Sophie sat at the table, leafing through photographs of Seattle taken during their walks around the city. The new landscape, the skyscrapers, the parks, the bay was like the promise of a new life, where she could be neither Rick's wife nor the betrayed victim, but simply Sophie. On the table was a letter that had arrived in the morning mail. The Austin postmark made her heart skip a beat, but she opened the envelope and pulled out a card. It was a simple photograph of Lady Bird Lake at sunset, and inside, neatly written, "Thank you for everything. Remember happiness where it is. Daniel." Sophie clutched the card to her chest, her eyes misty, but she smiled. It was not a love letter, not an attempt to bring back the past. It was an acknowledgement of their shared history, their pain, their victory that had now faded into an eternity of change. She walked to the window, where the first flowers of spring were breaking through the earth, their petals like symbols of rebirth. Seattle was a new beginning, a new landscape where she could find herself. She didn't know if she'd ever return to Austin, if she'd ever see Daniel again, but something inside her told her it didn't matter. Their history, their revenge, their love were knots in a web of fate, and each had left its mark. She leaned against the sill, her gaze fixed on the future, and for the first time in a long time, She smiled not at the past, but at the road ahead. Emily, who remained in Austin, sat in her garden, her children playing nearby, their laughter the only sound in the silence. She had learned to live with the pain, with the lessons life had taught her. Her house was empty, but she had begun to find a place for herself in that emptiness, not the Emily who had lied and betrayed, but the one who could start over. Daniel, now the sole owner of the firm, rebuilt it from the ground up, pouring into it not only his knowledge, but also his determination to be the best father he could be to Lily and Max. He knew Lily wasn't his biological daughter, but it didn't matter, she was his daughter, and he loved her as much as he loved Max. Every morning, he looked at their pictures and promised himself that he would do everything he could to keep their smiles on his face. Rick Stanton was gone from their lives. His name was synonymous with betrayal. His reputation was in ruins. His world was shattered. He left Austin, leaving behind only rumors and the shadows of his mistakes. Where he was now, no one knew, and no one wanted to know. Sophie, Daniel, and Emily went their separate ways, their paths diverging, but their story remained in a web of light and shadow, woven by their love, pain, and revenge. Life went on, and in its incompleteness, in its open questions, there was a secret, the secret of new beginnings that are born from the ashes of old worlds. Sophie looked at the flowers outside the window, Daniel at the smiles of his children, Emily at the empty garden, and each of them knew. Something new was waiting for them ahead, even if they could not yet see its outlines. The story has come to an end. Share your opinion in the comments. It is important for us to hear every word you say. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.